It was just another regular evening when James was walking home from his job. The sky had started turning orange as the sun dipped below the horizon, signaling the end of a long day. He wasn't in a rush, just thinking about what he would have for dinner when his thoughts were suddenly interrupted. A police car pulled up next to him so quickly that James barely had time to react. The sirens weren't on, but the car came to a screeching halt. Before James could take a step back or understand what was happening, the officer inside the car shouted at him, "Hey, you, stop right there." James froze. He didn't know if the officer was talking to him or someone else. He glanced around, but the street was empty, and the officer's eyes were locked on him. He quickly raised his hands in confusion. "Is something wrong, officer?" The officer got out of the car, towering over James as he approached. His eyes were sharp, his voice stern. "You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for." James's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? He hadn't done anything wrong. He had no idea what the officer was talking about. I'm just walking home," James said, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what you mean. I'm not the one you're looking for." The officer didn't seem to care. "Tell it to the judge. Put your hands behind your back." James's mind raced. He tried to stay calm, but confusion took over. He looked around again, hoping someone would see this and help, but the street was still empty. The officer was quick, his movements swift and forceful, as he grabbed James's arm and twisted it behind his back. "What is this about?" James asked, now panicking. "You're making a mistake. I didn't do anything." "Shut up and don't resist," the officer snapped, tightening his grip on James's wrist. James felt his chest tighten. His breaths were quick and shallow. He tried to explain again, but the officer wouldn't listen. He was too focused on his task, pulling James toward the police car. "This isn't right," James said, his voice rising. "I didn't do anything. I'm just a guy walking home from work." The officer didn't respond. The car door slammed shut as James was pushed inside, and he couldn't help but feel like he was in a nightmare. How had this happened? Just moments ago, he had been minding his own business. Inside the car, James's head swam with 1,000 thoughts. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew something wasn't right. Why was he being treated this way? Why hadn't the officer even asked any questions before arresting him? The officer climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and they sped off down the road. James's mind was spinning. He was trapped in the back of a police car, with no idea why. The only thing he could do was stare out the window, watching the world pass by as the car raced toward the station. "What are you going to charge me with?" James asked, his voice shaky as he tried to get some answers. "I don't even know what's going on here." The officer didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel. James felt a wave of panic rising in his chest. He had never been in trouble with the law before, and now he was being arrested for something he didn't do. It didn't make sense. The car turned a corner and pulled into the police station's parking lot. James's stomach twisted with fear. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. His heart was racing, and his palms were sweaty as they parked in front of the building. The officer turned off the engine but didn't speak. A second officer walked over to the car and opened the door, his eyes scanning James up and down. He didn't seem to have any sympathy. "Get out," the officer ordered. James stepped out of the car, feeling weak in his knees. The two officers led him toward the entrance of the station, where a few people were waiting in line. They all looked at James curiously as he was escorted inside, but no one said a word. He was pushed into a small room, the door slamming shut behind him. James stood there in the dim light, feeling completely lost. The reality of the situation was setting in. He was in a holding cell. His mind raced as he wondered if anyone even knew he was here. No one had been there to stop the officers. No one had come to his defense. He tried to take a deep breath to calm himself, but it didn't help. His hands were shaking, and his thoughts were a jumbled mess. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting there when he suddenly heard the sound of footsteps. His heart skipped a beat. Was someone coming to help him? Or was this just the beginning of something much worse? James sat in the small holding cell, his thoughts racing. The cold, concrete walls around him seemed to close in, making him feel trapped. He tried to make sense of everything, but the events that had led him here didn't add up. How had his evening gone from a peaceful walk home to sitting in a police cell? He couldn't stop replaying the moment the officer had grabbed him. The look in the officer's eyes, the way his hands felt tight around James's arm, it all felt so wrong. He had done nothing wrong. Why had they arrested him? James rubbed his face with his hands, trying to calm himself. He looked around the room, trying to focus on something other than the confusion swirling inside his head. The metal bench was uncomfortable, and the single light above him buzzed softly, making the silence feel even more suffocating. It felt like hours had passed, but he had no idea how long he had been in this cell. Was anyone going to come? Was anyone going to explain why he was here? A part of him wanted to scream for help, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. The officers had ignored his pleas earlier. He had tried to explain, tried to tell them he didn't belong here, but they hadn't cared. His hands still ached from where they'd twisted his arms behind his back. He rubbed them gently, still feeling the tightness from the rough arrest. James had always tried to be a good person. He worked hard, kept to himself, and never got involved in trouble. So why was this happening to him? His thoughts turned to his family. He had always been the one they turned to for support. What would his mom think if she found out he was in a police station? Would she believe it? Would she be as confused and angry as he was? He thought about his younger brother, Malik, who had always looked up to him. Would Malik be worried? Would he come looking for him? James's mind kept circling back to the same question. Why had this happened to him? The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts, and James sat up straight, hoping someone was finally coming to explain what was going on. The door to the cell creaked open, and a new officer stepped inside. He was tall, wearing a dark blue uniform, his face unreadable. "Get up," the officer said, his voice cold. James obeyed without saying a word. There was no point in arguing. The officers weren't listening to him anyway. The officer led him down the narrow hallway, past several other cells. James glanced at the people inside, wondering if any of them had been arrested for the same reason, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They reached a small interrogation room. The officer opened the door and gestured for James to sit. James sat down in the chair, his hands still trembling. The officer remained standing, watching him carefully. There was no sign of kindness, no attempt to reassure him. "Do you know why you're here?" the officer asked. James shook his head. He didn't know why he was here. He didn't even understand what was happening. "No," he said quietly. "I've done nothing wrong. You have the wrong person." The officer didn't reply at first. He just stared at James, his eyes sharp and calculating. Then, after a moment of silence, he spoke again. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." James blinked. "I don't understand. Who are you looking for?" "I've been walking home from work." The officer finally took a step closer, crossing his arms. "We're looking for a suspect who was involved in a robbery in this area. We were given your description. A man fitting your description was seen near the scene of the crime." James shook his head quickly. "I wasn't near any robbery. I don't know anything about that." The officer's expression remained unchanged. "That's what we need to figure out. You'll stay here until we sort it out." James's mind raced. A robbery? I wasn't even close to the area. How could they think I was involved? He wanted to shout, to tell the officer that he was innocent, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. The officer didn't seem interested in his side of the story. James felt the weight of his situation sink in. The more the officer talked, the less hope James had. He knew that things weren't looking good for him. No one had believed him before, and no one was likely to believe him now. He was just another man in a system that didn't care about the truth. James took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He had to think. He had to figure out a way out of this mess. There had to be a way for someone to understand that he was innocent. That's when it hit him. His brother. Malik's older brother. The U.S. Attorney General. James's pulse quickened as he realized he had a way out. Malik could help him. Malik had the power to make this all stop. The officer's voice broke through his thoughts. Are you going to answer my questions or not? James looked up, his eyes clear. I want to call my brother, he said firmly. The officer frowned. Your brother? Who is he? James raised his head high. I want to call Malik. He's the U.S. Attorney General. You can call him, or I will. The officer's face changed. There was a brief moment of hesitation. Then the officer left the room without saying another word. James sat back in the chair, his heart pounding. He had just taken the first step toward proving his innocence, but he had no idea what would happen next. Would his brother really be able to help him? Would his powerful position be enough to get him out of this nightmare? All James could do was wait and hope. James sat in the interrogation room, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His thoughts raced. He had always been the one people turned to when they needed help, but now it was him who needed help. His chest tightened as he thought about the one person who might be able to make this all stop, his brother Malik. He had never imagined he would be in a situation like this. He thought of his brother, a man with power, with influence. Malik was the U.S. Attorney General, someone who could change things in an instant. If anyone could get him out of this mess, it was him. James's hands trembled as he thought about making the call. Would Malik even answer? Would he be able to do anything from so far away? He had to try. The door to the room clicked open, and James looked up, startled. The officer who had been questioning him earlier stood in the doorway, holding a phone in his hand. He didn't say anything at first, just held it out toward James. Here, the officer said flatly. Call your brother. James didn't hesitate. He took the phone from the officer's hand, his fingers brushing against the cool plastic. For a moment, he just stared at the screen. His heart was pounding in his chest. He could feel the tension building as he scrolled to Malik's number. His thumb hovered over the green call button for a second, but he quickly pressed it. The phone rang. Once. Twice. James's throat felt dry. What if Malik didn't pick up? What if he didn't have time to help him? James squeezed his eyes shut, trying to steady his nerves. The ringing stopped suddenly, and then he heard his brother's familiar voice on the other end. James, what's going on? Malik asked, his voice calm but concerned. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Hearing his brother's voice gave him a small sense of relief. It was like a lifeline in the middle of all the chaos. Malik, I need your help, James said quickly, his voice shaking. I've been arrested. They say I'm involved in a robbery I know nothing about. They're holding me here, and no one's listening to me. I don't know what to do. There was a long pause on the other end. James could hear Malik's sharp intake of breath. What do you mean you've been arrested? What's going on? James could hear his brother's concern turning into urgency. Malik, please. You have to help me. They won't believe me. They won't even listen to me. I don't know how long I can stay here. Malik's voice softened but carried a note of authority. Hold on, James. I'm going to fix this. Don't worry. I'll get you out of there. James felt a rush of relief, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that still hung in the air. What could Malik actually do? He had never needed to rely on his brother's position like this before. Could Malik's influence truly change the outcome of this situation? Malik, please. Hurry, James whispered, his voice low and filled with fear. I don't want to be stuck here. I don't want them to think I'm guilty. James, I'm on my way. Stay calm. I'm going to make sure they know you're innocent, Malik reassured him, his voice firm. The line went silent for a moment as Malik likely made calls of his own. James could hear his own breathing, heavy and nervous, as he tried to hold on to the hope that Malik would be able to do what he said. But then, the officer re-entered the room and gave James a sharp look. "You're wasting time. Your call is over. Get ready to be processed." James's heart sank. He wasn't ready to be processed. He wasn't ready for this nightmare to be real. But as the officer reached to take the phone away, James tightened his grip on it. He needed a little more time. Just a little. "Please, just a little longer," James pleaded, his voice breaking. "My brother, he's going to fix this." The officer didn't respond. He just pulled the phone from James's hand with no sympathy. "Enough. You'll get your answers soon enough." James watched helplessly as the officer left the room again. The door clicked shut, leaving him alone once more. The only sound was the echo of his thoughts. Would Malik be able to get to him in time? Would his brother's position really change anything? As he sat there, staring at the empty space in front of him, James realized that for the first time in his life, he was completely dependent on someone else. He wasn't sure if it was a good thing or a bad thing, but right now, it was his only chance. His mind wandered back to the phone call, his brother's voice still echoing in his ears. "Stay calm. I'm going to fix this." James had no choice but to wait, but the uncertainty of the situation gnawed at him. Every minute felt like an hour. Would he be released soon? Or would he be left here in a cell, caught in the chaos of a mistake he couldn't fix? James sat in the small, cold room, feeling every second drag on like a heavy weight. The silence around him was deafening. His mind kept racing, wondering if Malik was already on his way or if his brother's calls had made any difference. Was Malik's power enough to get him out of this nightmare? The officer had left the room again, leaving James with nothing but his thoughts. He kept replaying the same questions over and over. Why was this happening to him? Why had they arrested him? And most importantly, would his brother be able to fix this before it was too late? His stomach twisted with anxiety as he thought about how this could affect his future. A mistake like this could ruin everything for him. James had always kept his nose clean, worked hard, and stayed out of trouble. He didn't deserve this. Yet here he was, sitting in a police station, accused of something he didn't do. His entire world had been turned upside down in the blink of an eye. The door opened suddenly, making James jump in surprise. The same officer walked in, this time with a different expression on his face. His lips were set in a hard line, and his eyes were narrowed. "Your brother's called," the officer said coldly. "The U.S. Attorney General's office. They've made a few calls." James's heart skipped a beat. Was Malik's influence starting to take effect? James looked up at the officer, trying to stay calm, though his nerves were shot. "And?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer crossed his arms, studying James closely. "You're still being held for questioning." But the officer added, his voice a little less harsh, "We're looking into the situation. For now, you're not going anywhere." James felt a small burst of relief. They weren't throwing him in jail right away. That meant Malik's calls were being taken seriously. But the officer's words still felt like a warning. He wasn't free yet. The tension in James's chest tightened again. He wasn't out of danger. The officer didn't say anything else, turning to leave the room. James could hear his footsteps echo down the hall, each step carrying the weight of his uncertainty. James leaned back in the chair, his head spinning. What happens next? Time seemed to slow. Every minute felt like an eternity. He wasn't sure if he would even make it out of here today. The fear was overwhelming. But in the back of his mind, there was a flicker of hope. Malik was on his side. Malik would fix this. But how long would that take? James's thoughts drifted to the idea that his brother might have pulled some strings. Could he have reached out to the right people to get this case looked at more seriously? Maybe someone had checked the security footage or reviewed witness statements. Maybe the officers would see that he wasn't the man they were looking for. James clung to that hope. But with every passing moment, doubt crept in. What if it wasn't enough? What if it wasn't enough to make them believe him? What if, after all the phone calls and influence, they still treated him like a suspect? The minutes turned to hours, and James felt like he was losing control. Every passing second only added to the unbearable tension building inside him. It felt like he was suffocating. He just wanted to be free from this mess. But until then, he had no choice but to wait. Finally, the door opened once more. This time, it wasn't the officer. There was a man in a suit standing in the doorway, his expression serious. He was older, with graying hair and sharp, calculating eyes. The man stepped inside, his gaze locking onto James immediately. "You James?" he asked, his voice smooth and calm. James nodded slowly, his heart racing again. "Yes. Who are you?" The man didn't smile, but he extended his hand. "I'm from the Attorney General's office. Your brother called me. We're taking over from here." A wave of relief washed over James. He finally felt like someone important had arrived. Someone who could fix everything. "Does this mean I'm free to go?" James asked, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. The man gave a small nod. "Not yet, but we're getting things sorted. Don't worry, you'll be out of here soon." James swallowed hard, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to spill. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear those words. He hadn't realized how much hope he had been clinging to, desperate for someone to take charge and make things right. But even as relief flooded his system, another thought crossed his mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if all this still wasn't enough to prove his innocence? As the man turned to leave the room, James's mind swirled with questions. The tension wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in hours, he allowed himself a small breath of hope. James sat in the same cold room, but this time, something was different. The man from the Attorney General's office, who had walked in earlier, was now sitting across from him. The man's eyes were calm, but there was an air of authority about him that made James feel a little more at ease. "You're James, right?" the man asked again, his voice steady. James nodded, his nerves still buzzing in his chest. "Yes. I've been here for hours. What's going to happen now?" The man smiled slightly, then leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "We've reviewed the situation. Your brother's influence is already making a difference. The case is being re-examined. The officers have already begun to take a closer look at the evidence." James's heart skipped a beat. Was it really happening? Was he going to get out of here soon? But the man continued, his voice now serious. "There's one thing we need to clear up first. Something that doesn't sit right." James's stomach dropped. What now? His hope was starting to fade again. Could it be something else they were looking into? Was he still going to be blamed? The man paused, watching him carefully. "We've reviewed the security footage from the area where the robbery took place. We've also gone over witness statements. And James, there's one thing that stands out." James felt his palms sweat. The room seemed to close in around him. Was this it? Was this where everything turned against him? "You weren't the one involved in the robbery," the man said flatly, but his tone was firm. "It's clear now. The man they arrested you for isn't you. There's a mistake in the police report, and the evidence against you doesn't hold up. Someone else was behind it, and it wasn't you." James blinked, hardly able to process what the man was saying. The truth. They finally saw it. The man's eyes softened just slightly. "The officers who arrested you were acting on bad information. They didn't have the full picture. But don't worry, James. You're not guilty. And we're going to make sure everyone knows it." A flood of relief rushed through James. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. For so long, he had felt trapped in a nightmare, unable to break free. But now, it was finally over. Or at least, it was starting to be. The man stood up, his expression turning more serious again. "I'm going to make sure this is cleared up completely. Your name will be cleared. Just stay calm a little longer." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He couldn't believe it. It felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but there was still a part of him that couldn't let go of the fear. What if they still didn't believe him? What if the mistake wasn't enough to fix everything? The man seemed to read James's mind. Don't worry. Everything's going to be all right. You've got people on your side now. With that, the man turned and walked out of the room. James sat there, alone again, but this time, the silence felt different. It felt hopeful. The minutes passed slowly, but James couldn't stop his mind from racing. Could this really be over? Could the nightmare he had been living finally come to an end? He wanted to believe it, but part of him still felt uncertain. He needed to see the proof. He needed to know that the officers who had treated him like a criminal would now understand their mistake. A few more minutes passed before the door opened again. This time, it was the officer who had been so harsh earlier. His expression was unreadable as he stepped inside, but there was a small piece of paper in his hand. He didn't say anything at first, just held the paper out toward James. James took it hesitantly, his eyes scanning the words on the page. It was a release form. "We've cleared things up," the officer said, his voice flat. "You're free to go." James's eyes widened as he read the paper again. It was real. It was happening. He wasn't going to be locked up anymore. The truth had been revealed, and he was being set free. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky as he stepped toward the door. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to walk freely. The weight of the past hours still hung over him, but the feeling of freedom was overpowering. As he walked out of the room and into the hallway, he saw the man from the Attorney General's office waiting by the door. The man gave him a nod of approval. "Good luck, James. We'll be in touch to make sure everything is handled properly." James nodded back, trying to smile, but the relief he felt was overwhelming. He didn't know what would come next, but for now, he was free. He walked out of the building, the sunlight hitting his face for the first time in hours. It felt good, but the memory of the fear still lingered in his chest. He had been lucky. Not everyone in his situation would have been able to count on someone as powerful as Malik. But for now, James was thankful. He was free, and he would do everything he could to make sure that no one else had to experience the same nightmare. James stepped outside the police station, the cool air hitting his face. For the first time in hours, he took a deep breath. The weight on his chest seemed to lift with every step. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't guilty. He was free. But even as he felt the freedom, his mind was still spinning. The last few days had been a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and uncertainty. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, how quickly everything had gone wrong. He had always known life wasn't fair, but he hadn't known it could turn so fast. 1 minute, he was just a regular guy, going about his day. The next, he was sitting in a cold room, accused of something he hadn't done, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As he walked down the steps of the station, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing a message from Malik. "You good? We need to talk soon." James smiled a little. Malik had come through for him. Without his brother's help, he might still be stuck in that cold room, unsure of what would happen next. He quickly typed a response. "I'm free. They cleared my name." The reply came quickly. "I knew you'd be all right. Let's meet up. We'll figure out the next steps." James felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. Malik hadn't just saved him. He had protected him. He had used everything in his power to make sure James didn't lose his future, and for that, James would be forever thankful. As he walked toward the street, a thought crossed his mind. What now? The world hadn't just let him go. He wasn't just going to forget everything that had happened. The fear, the uncertainty, the way he had been treated, it would stay with him for a long time. But he had to move forward. He had to keep going. The worst was over. But he still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He'd been through too much. The police, the arrest, the way they had treated him like a criminal, it left a scar on his soul. He couldn't let it go. Not yet. Not until he knew the truth about who had caused all of this to happen. James's mind drifted to the officers involved in his case. How many of them were truly sorry for what they had done? How many were just doing their job, following orders, and never questioning whether they were in the wrong? And what would happen to them now that the truth was out? He couldn't forget the way they had looked at him, the way they had judged him based on his appearance, and nothing else. The way they had believed the worst about him without even asking questions. It wasn't just a mistake. It was something deeper, something wrong. But right now, there was nothing he could do about it. He had been cleared, and for the moment, that was enough. He walked a few more blocks, his thoughts still racing. He had to focus on moving forward. He couldn't stay stuck in the past. He needed to rebuild his life, find a way to heal from everything that had happened. He had to keep his head up, no matter how hard it felt. As he reached the corner, a familiar car pulled up beside him. It was Malik's car. The door opened, and Malik stepped out, a look of concern on his face. "You all right?" he asked, his voice full of care. James nodded slowly, his mind still spinning. "Yeah, I'm fine now." Malik gave him a long, thoughtful look before pulling him into a hug. "I told you, didn't I? You're not in this alone." James hugged his brother back, feeling a deep sense of comfort. With Malik by his side, he could face whatever came next. The world might have tried to break him, but it hadn't. It had made him stronger, more determined. And with Malik's support, he knew he could face anything. Together, they'd get through it all. As they pulled away from the hug, Malik gave him a small, knowing smile. "Come on, let's get you something to eat. We've got a lot to talk about." James smiled back, his heart lighter than it had been in days. The worst was behind him. Now, it was time to start moving forward. James sat at the small table in Malik's favorite diner, a hot cup of coffee in front of him. He hadn't felt hungry until now, but as he stared down at the steaming mug, he realized how much he needed this. He needed normal. He needed peace. The events of the last few days felt like a blur. His arrest, the long hours of waiting, the uncertainty that had gripped him at every turn. But now, sitting here with Malik, the weight was slowly lifting off his shoulders. "Feeling better?" Malik asked, his voice soft but full of concern. James looked up at his brother, giving him a small smile. "Yeah, I think I'm finally starting to process everything. It's just a lot to take in, you know." Malik nodded, understanding completely. He'd been there through it all, supporting James every step of the way. "I can't even imagine what you went through. But you're out of it now. You've got a second chance." James stared out the window for a moment, thinking about how close he had come to losing everything. His future, his reputation, even his peace of mind. Everything had been put on the line. He had been thrown into a situation where all he could do was wait, hope, and pray for the truth to come to light. "And you were right," James said, turning back to Malik. "It was a mistake. But it feels like more than that. It's hard to shake off the way they treated me. The way they didn't even try to see the truth." Malik sighed. "I get it, bro. It's hard to trust people when they've done you wrong. But what matters is that you're free now, and we can make sure nothing like this happens again." James took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He still didn't know if he'd ever truly forget the feeling of being wrongfully accused, but Malik was right. He was free. That was the most important thing. "So, what now?" James asked quietly, his voice uncertain. "What happens next?" Malik smiled warmly, reaching over to pat his brother's hand. "Next, you take your life back. You get back to your job, your goals, your future. You don't let this define you, James. You've got the power to keep moving forward." James nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The truth had come out. He had been exonerated. The officers who had wrongfully arrested him would face the consequences of their actions, but he wasn't going to let their mistake hold him back. "Thanks, Malik," James said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You really came through for me." Malik chuckled softly. "You know I always got your back." They both sat in silence for a moment, sipping their drinks, letting the weight of the situation finally settle into the past. It was over. The nightmare had ended, and now James could look ahead. But the last few days had taught him something important. It wasn't just about getting through tough times. It was about the people who stood by you when everything else seemed lost. Malik had been there for him when no one else would have believed in him, and James would never forget that. As they finished their coffee, James knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. He was going to use what he'd learned. He was going to be stronger, more focused, and more determined to build the life he had worked so hard for. The world could be cruel, and sometimes life threw things at you that felt impossible to handle. But James had made it through, and now he was ready for whatever came next. James stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's go. I've got a lot of work to do." Malik smiled proudly as he stood up to join him. "That's the spirit. Let's get to work." Together, they left the diner, stepping out into the world with a sense of hope and determination. The past was behind them, and the future was waiting.